I've been working nights at the mall for a few months now, mostly painting and doing odd jobs when the place is shut down. It's easy money, and honestly, I prefer the quiet. No people, no distractions, just me, my brush, and the endless stretch of walls needing fresh coats. The management hired me to repaint the service corridors behind the storefronts, those narrow, sterile hallways that run behind everything, unseen by customers, but used by all the employees. It's all white paint, fluorescent lighting, and the occasional echo when you move too fast. It's probably a last-ditch effort to save the mall before it goes under. Tonight was no different, or at least that's what I thought going in. It was just after close when I arrived, the mall's emptiness sprawling out before me like a maze of glass and polished tile. I grabbed my supplies from the back of my truck and made my way inside through the employee entrance. The hallways back there are a labyrinth, long corridors intersecting at odd angles, all leading to storage rooms and emergency exits. The fluorescent lights flicked occasionally, adding to the sterile unease of the place. Without the sound of the droll background music or of the people shopping, the only noise I could hear was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Every noise I made clattered in the open mall, echoing off the walls. It reminded me of how alone I was, and yet I swore something had just moved behind me. I'd been painting for about an hour when I first noticed it, a soft, scraping sound, faint like something brushing against the wall. I stopped mid-stroke, listening. I turned around, brush still in hand, and scanned the hallway. There was nothing, just the empty, freshly painted walls and a stack of supply boxes by the back entrance. I shook it off, figuring it was just the ventilation kicking in. Malls make weird noises at night. I got to work, the rhythmic back and forth of my roller filling the void. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate, dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the tile floor. I put my roller down and stepped into the center of the hallway. My pulse quickened as I peered around the corner. The corridor was still empty, and yet the sound persisted, getting closer. I thought it might be the security officer that was supposed to be around, but in all the nights I'd been painting, I hadn't seen him once. "Hello?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the long stretch of hall. I waited, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. No response. Just the hollow emptiness of the mall corridor. I laughed nervously at myself. Maybe the isolation was just getting to me. Too many nights alone in this weird, sterile place. But then I saw it. There was a person at the end of the corridor. I could barely see them in the shadow by the dark entrance. My heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. When I blinked, the shadow was gone. I stood frozen for a moment, my arms covered in goosebumps. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the security guard doing rounds, or someone on the other side of the door looking in. But the rational part of my brain was having a hard time keeping up with the cold, creeping dread that had settled into my chest. Still, I got back to painting, keeping my eyes on the walls in front of me, but my ears straining for that sound again. For a while it was silent, except for the roller sliding up and down the wall. I kept looking down the corridor in the direction of the shadow, but it was empty. Then I heard it again, that scraping noise. I packed up my paint supplies, deciding that I needed a break. Maybe I would try and find that useless security guard. It wasn't my job to deal with break-ins. No job is worth sticking around for whatever that was. But as I made my way toward the service exit, I heard the shuffling sound again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close, right behind me. I turned to see an empty corridor. I sped up, my boots echoing loudly as they slapped against the floor. But the sound followed me, keeping pace, growing louder and more insistent. I rounded a corner and found myself at a dead end, a door that wasn't the service exit, and my stomach dropped. I must have taken a wrong turn, but that didn't make sense. I knew this layout. I'd been working here for months. How could I have gotten lost? The scraping noise was right behind me now. I could hear it as clear as day, something heavy dragging itself down the hall, closer and closer. I spun around, heart pounding, and there it was again, the figure. But this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face partly hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, like something out of a painting from another century. His eyes were hollow, black, like they'd been gouged out long ago. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his head cocked slightly to the side, as if waiting for something. I backed up until my spine hit that wall, my chest heaving. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the man stepped forward, his boots shuffling against the floor in slow, deliberate steps. His body moved unnaturally, like he was more shadow than solid. The lights overhead seemed darker, dimmer, like he was sucking up all the light. His hollow eyes stayed fixed on mine as he closed the distance between us. I reached for the door handle behind me, frantically twisting it, but it was locked. My mind raced, my hands shaking as I yanked at that door, willing it to open. When the man was only a few feet from me, he smiled. A slow, cruel smile that spread across his face like an infection. I closed my eyes tight, and I could hear the sound of his footsteps right in front of me, feel his presence looming over me, suffocating me as I dropped to the ground, covering my head. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, the hallway was empty. No man, no shuffling sound, nothing. I didn't stick around that empty corridor to find out what happened next. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the exit. I called in and quit the job the next morning. Whatever was haunting that mall, it wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. The kitchen was quiet, an unusual stillness hanging in the air after all the remodeling over the past few months. The old building looked new again. They'd kept the old brick walls, but otherwise the place was modern and clean. You'd never know the building was over 100 years old. I sat in the back office, hunched over the papers spread across my desk. The restaurant was set to open in just a few weeks, and I was finalizing the new menu. Each dish had been meticulously planned, the ingredients sourced from local farms, and every order was scheduled so it would arrive at just the right time before opening. I was proud of it. My head throbbed from hours of tweaking recipes, but I was nearly done, just a few more revisions. Behind me, the droning hum of the refrigerators and the clicking of the fluorescent lights above were the only sounds. The kitchen had been locked up for the night, with everyone gone hours ago. Just me, alone, finishing up before I could call it a day. I looked down at the layout of my dishes. Something wasn't right about the plating on the seared tuna. Maybe it needed more color. I scribbled notes in the margin, but as I wrote, I noticed something odd. A chill had crept into the room. A cold draft seemed to seep from somewhere in the kitchen, unnatural in the dead of summer. Kitchens are never cold. I glanced at the office door leading out to the kitchen. It was open just an inch. I didn't remember leaving it that way. The kitchen was shut down and cleaned, and I could see a sliver of stainless steel counters beyond the door, the cold, polished surfaces reflecting the office light. And then I heard it. Not a whisper or a creak, something sharper, more distinct. The metallic clink of a knife hitting the countertop. I sat up straight, my heart skipping a beat. Every knife had been put away when the last cook left. I knew that. The knife block was always in order, the blades polished, the handles gleaming in neat rows. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe one of the knives hadn't been set in properly. Maybe the metal contracted in the cold, making it shift. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the noise too loud in the quiet. I stepped to the door, pushing it open slightly, just enough to peer into the kitchen. There they were, the knives, all lined up in their usual place, seemingly untouched. But then, another clink. One of my chef knives, one of the large ones, the kind I used to break down whole chickens, had fallen and was now lying flat on the counter. My stomach twisted at the sight. That knife had been secure. I had put it away myself. I stepped out from the office, drawn toward the kitchen by a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The stainless steel counters stretched out before me, eerily spotless in the dim light. The knife lay motionless now, but there was something about the stillness of it that made me even more nervous. Usually, a fallen knife would rock with inertia from that distance. I took a deep breath and reached for the handle, intending to put it back into place. But as my fingers hovered over the blade, the others began to shift. At first, it was a small movement, just a slight tilt, as if they were balancing on an invisible thread. But then, with a loud clang, the boning knife fell, sliding off the counter and clattering onto the floor. The noise echoed through the kitchen, bouncing off the tiles. My pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. Knives don't just fall like that. I crouched to pick it up, feeling the cool metal of the blade between my fingers. But before I could straighten, the cleaver, massive, heavy, dropped from its spot and slammed onto the cutting board with a sickening thud, the edge bearing into the wood. I froze. My hands were still gripping the boning knife, but my eyes were locked on the cleaver, now half buried in the cutting board, as though some unseen force had slammed it down with precision and intent. I could feel the hair on my arms rise, the chill in the air now undeniable, my breath quickening despite the silence. One by one, the knives began to move. It started slowly with the smaller ones, the paring knives, the utility blades twitching in place like they were vibrating, like something was pulling at them. They scraped against the counter, metal screeching on metal, until they too slid off, falling in rapid, chaotic rhythm. The chef's knife I'd originally seen, my personal knife, the one with the thick handle, was the last. It seemed to teeter on the edge, wobbling with a sickening anticipation until it tipped over. But instead of simply falling, it slid across the counter, slow and deliberate, like it was being guided. The blade stopped just inches from the edge, pointed directly at me. I took a step back, the boning knife still in my hand. I could feel my grip tightening, my knuckles white around the handle. Something was wrong. None of this was accidental. This wasn't the ventilation or the building settling. This was deliberate, methodical, like something invisible was in control. I looked around the kitchen, scanning the room for anything, any explanation, any hint that someone was playing a twisted joke on me. But the kitchen was empty. There were no shadows, no figures lurking in the corners, just the knives strewn across the floor and counter like discarded weapons after a battle. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, none of them making sense. I was a chef. I knew my kitchen. I knew my tools. This didn't happen. Then, without warning, the cleaver lifted. It didn't fall this time. It didn't drop. It rose, slowly, impossibly, the blade pulling free from the cutting board as though held by an unseen hand. It hovered in the air, just inches above the counter, swaying slightly, as if deciding where to strike next. I stumbled back, the boning knife slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. I turned, ready to run, ready to bolt for the door. But before I could take another step, the cleaver dropped. It slammed into the stainless counter with a force that made the entire kitchen shake, the sound deafening, the blade embedding itself deep into the surface. It stood there, quivering, as if daring me to come closer. I didn't. I backed away, slowly, never taking my eyes off that cleaver, never looking away from the mess of knives scattered around me. I reached the door and slipped through it, closing it behind me with a shaky hand, the cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The kitchen was silent again. But I knew something had been there with me, and whatever it was sending a message. It wasn't done. I left the restaurant that night and didn't tell anyone what happened. We opened without any issues, and it's been 3 months. But I don't ever stay late in that building alone. I've been a cable technician for almost 10 years, and I've been inside hundreds of homes. You get used to the odd smells, the cramped spaces, even the occasional hoarder house. But this job, this one still wakes me up at night. It was an average call, a service upgrade for a rural home past the suburbs. The work order said they wanted to upgrade their internet to handle streaming better, which was nothing strange. But when I got there, I noticed the house was isolated, surrounded by overgrown trees and fields that looked like they hadn't been tended to in years. It sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, the kind you only drive down if you know exactly where you're going. I actually passed the driveway accidentally and had to double back. The paint on the house was peeling, and the curtains on the windows were drawn. Something about the place felt off right away, but I shrugged it off. I'd been in worse places. I knocked on the door and waited. It took a while for someone to answer, and when the door did finally open, the smell hit me before anything else. A musty, sour stench, like wet wood and something rotting beneath it. Standing in the doorway was an older man, probably mid-60s, wearing a stained undershirt and pants that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His eyes were glassy, and his face was expressionless. "You the cable guy?" he asked, his voice gravelly and slow, like he hadn't spoken in a while. I nodded, and he stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in without a word. I walked past him into the house, my boots sinking into the brown, worn-out carpet. The inside was worse than the outside. Old, dusty furniture, piles of newspapers stacked against the walls, and the same sour smell intensifying as I headed further into the house. The man pointed to the back of the house where the modem was. That's when I saw him. His son, I guessed. The guy had to be in his mid-30s, sitting in an old recliner in the corner of the living room, staring at a blank TV screen. He didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, eyes wide open, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair like he was bracing for something. "That's my boy," the old man said from behind me. His voice was low, almost a growl. "He don't talk much." I nodded, forcing a polite smile, but something about the son, about the way he sat, completely motionless, made my skin crawl. I hurried to the corner of the room where the modem was. I got to work quickly, checking the cables and running diagnostics. The silence in the house was suffocating. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood floor as I moved over it. I tried to make small talk, asking the old man how long they'd lived out there, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me with those glassy eyes. As I worked, I felt like I was the entertainment, not just for the old man, but for the son, too. Even though he hadn't moved an inch since I walked in, I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every movement. I tried to ignore it and focus on the job, but then I noticed something strange. The cables running into the wall, they were old, way older than they should have been for an internet upgrade. When I went to pull them out, I saw there was a dim light on the other side of the wall, and I saw an empty plate on the floor. I know they must have seen my surprise, and I tried to keep a poker face. That's when the old man spoke again. He don't like it when people touch his things. I froze, my hand still on the cables. The son, who hadn't moved the entire time, suddenly turned his head toward me, his neck creaking like an old door hinge. His eyes locked on mine, wide and unblinking. He didn't say anything, but his mouth twitched slightly, like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. I stood there, unsure of what to do. My heart was racing, and all I could think about was getting out of that house. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I muttered something like, "I'll be quick," trying to keep my voice steady. I went back to work, but my hands were shaking now. I could feel both of them staring at me, their eyes burning holes into my back. I finished the installation as fast as I could, but when I turned around, the old man was standing much closer, too close. He was just inches away, his breath hot on my face. His eyes were wide now, wild and bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. "You're done," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, backing away toward the door. The son was still sitting in the recliner, but his posture had changed. His hands were gripping the armrest even tighter, his knuckles white. His mouth was moving again, but no sound came out. It looked like he was trying to scream, but nothing was coming out of him, like the air was being pulled right out of his lungs. I grabbed my tools and made a beeline for the front door, not caring if I was being rude. As I stepped outside, the old man followed me to the porch. I just kept walking, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway as I practically sprinted to my van. I threw my gear in the back, got in the driver's seat, and peeled out of there as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old man was still standing on the porch watching me. But the son, he was at the window now, his face pressed against the glass, his mouth still moving, still trying to scream. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that house as possible. Later that night, I tried to tell myself it was just a weird job, that I'd been overthinking it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that son, of the way his mouth moved like he was trapped in his own skin, screaming silently for someone to help. I called the police and reported the incident. They told me they would send someone to check it out. Honestly, I don't know what happened because I didn't want to know. But sometimes, when I wake up with a nightmare, I see him, that younger man pressed up against the window, mouth moving, eyes wide with terror. Dad had moved again after the divorce, this time into a small 2-story house just outside of town. It had a wraparound porch and a yard with overgrown grass, but the inside was nice. Dad had set it up with new furniture. My bedroom was bright, and he'd even gotten me a few new toys for when I visited. It felt like he was trying to make things normal again. It was the summer, and I was staying with Dad for the whole month. Mom said it would be good for us to spend more time together, but this new house felt weird. Not bad, just Weird. It had creaky floors and the basement door was always shut tight, which was strange because Dad said he never went down there. I asked him why, and he shrugged, saying it was just musty down there and he didn't need to use the space. The first couple of days were fine. Dad would leave for work early in the morning, and I'd have the house to myself until the afternoon. I liked being alone. I would watch TV, play with my iPad, or sometimes just sit on the porch and draw, listening to the birds. But on the third day, something strange happened. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating when there was a knock at the front door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was soft and quiet, like whoever was outside didn't want to be heard. I hesitated, but then went to the window to peek through the blinds. There was a woman standing there, maybe in her 40s, with matted hair and pale skin. She wore an old, tattered dress, and she was staring straight ahead at the door, her hands clasped together. I didn't like how she looked. Something about her made my stomach twist. I didn't open the door. After a minute, she knocked again, a little louder this time. Then, in a voice that was soft like a whisper, she said, "Hello? Is anyone home? I need to speak with you." Her tone was too calm, too gentle, like she had rehearsed the words. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping she'd just go away. But instead, she knocked again, harder, her voice now rising just a little. "I used to live here. Please, I just want to come in for a moment. I left something behind in the basement. I just need to get it." I froze. How did she know about the basement? I had never heard Dad mention a woman before, and if she used to live here, why would she come back like this, now? I backed away from the window, moving toward the back of the house, but her voice got more desperate. "Please, open the door. I need to get down to the basement. My daughter, she left something down there. I need to get it." I didn't know what to do. I ran to the living room and called my dad's number, my fingers trembling. It rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I left a voicemail, my voice shaky. "Dad, there's a lady at the door. She says she used to live here. Please call me back." I hung up and pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Through the window, I saw the woman step off the porch and walk around the side of the house, toward the back. My heart raced as I realized she was headed toward the exterior basement door. I heard the creak of the side gate opening, the rustle of grass as she moved closer. Then there was the sound of her pulling on the basement door handle, yanking at it hard. The door didn't open. It was locked, but she kept pulling, grunting under her breath. "Let me in. I need to see her. I need to see my daughter." I covered my ears, backing further into the house, my eyes wide with terror. She kept yanking on the handle, the wood creaking as if it might give way. I thought about running out the front door, but I was too scared. What if she saw me? What if she chased me? And where would I go? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The pulling, the yelling, it all went quiet. I held my breath, waiting. After a long moment, I finally worked up the courage to creep back to the window and peek out. She was gone. I called Dad again with my hands trembling, but there was still no answer. I didn't leave the house. I just sat there, curled up on the couch, staring at the front door, waiting for him to come home. When he called back, I told him everything, and he said he was leaving then and would be home in a few minutes. When he walked through the door, I ran to him almost in tears. I told him everything, about the woman, about her saying she used to live here, and about how she knew about the basement. Dad looked shaken, but tried to play it off. "It was probably just someone confused," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. But I could tell he didn't believe that. He avoided looking me in the eye. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept thinking about that woman, about how she knew exactly where to go, about the way she screamed for her daughter. And then I started to wonder, had there really been something down in the basement? Something that she had left behind? The next morning, I woke up early and went downstairs. Dad had left for work again. I ate breakfast quickly, trying to shake off the nerves, but as I was cleaning up the dishes, I heard it. A soft knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I ran to the front window and peeked out. She was back. The same woman, standing on the porch, staring at the door with those dead, empty eyes. I need to get to the basement. My daughter, she's waiting for me. This time, I didn't wait. I ran to the back of the house and locked myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard the side gate creak again, and then the sound of her pulling on that basement door, harder and harder, her breathing growing more frantic. Please, let me in. I just want to see her. She's mine. She's waiting for me. I curled up in the corner of the bathroom, tears streaming down my face, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, the silence was even worse. The next weekend, when I went back to Mom's, I told her about the woman. Mom called Dad, and I heard them on the phone talking quietly. She listened carefully, her face pale, and when she ended the call, she turned to me with a look of sadness I couldn't understand. That house, the one your dad moved into, it belonged to a woman who lost her daughter in a car accident. After her daughter died, the woman lost her mind. She's convinced her daughter is still alive, locked in the basement. I didn't go back to Dad's again that summer. I don't know what happened to the woman, but he sold the house and moved a few months later. I never did go down into that basement. I'd been a prison therapist for years, but I had never encountered a client like Vincent Hale. He wasn't like the others. Most inmates came in reluctantly, defiant or resigned, eager to manipulate or dismiss our sessions altogether. But Vincent, he was different. He walked into the therapy room with a calm confidence, almost serene. His file was thick, filled with violent crimes, assaults, arson, and a particularly brutal murder that earned him a life sentence. But in our sessions, he was polite, composed, his dark eyes always watching me too intently. Our first few meetings had been unsettling, but not abnormal. He answered questions vaguely, never offering much about his personal life, his motivations, or his crimes. But I pressed on, as I did with all my clients, trying to get through the surface to the core of who he really was. I felt I was making a little progress until he was scheduled for release on the 28th of that month, until the day things changed. It started subtly. During one of our sessions, he mentioned a red scarf. I imagine you like red scarves, he said, smiling slightly. It was an offhand comment, and I didn't think much of it at the time. He could have been fishing for a reaction, like many inmates do, trying to throw me off balance. I gave him nothing, steering the conversation back to the session. But a few days later, I found myself standing in front of my mirror at home, wearing a red scarf, one I'd bought years ago and worn out of habit. How had he known? The next session, he smiled when he saw me, that same thin-lipped, knowing smile. Red suits you, he said, his voice smooth. You've been wearing it a lot lately, haven't you? I froze for a moment, then shook it off. That's not important, Vincent, I said, my voice steady. Let's get back to what we were discussing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming with amusement, as if we were playing a game only he understood. Of course, Doctor, but you can't deny it suits you. I bet you wore it when you took that walk through the park on Sunday. He stared at me as my hand froze over my notepad. I had taken a walk that Sunday, alone, through the park near my house. How could he have known? I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He had no access to the outside world, no visitors, no contacts. His confinement was strict. And yet here he was, describing my life, my personal life, with terrifying accuracy. I think we should focus on your history, I said, forcing myself to sound calm. Tell me more about what led you to the incidents in your file. Vincent smiled again, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. Ah, but that's boring, isn't it? You know all about that. What you don't know is that I prefer watching you instead. I tried not to flinch. What do you mean by that, Vincent? He chuckled softly. The things you do, your routines. You're a creature of habit, aren't you, Doctor? The way you get up at 6 a.m. every day, make coffee with just a splash of cream, and sit by the window with your notepad. So many thoughts and observations, yet you miss the details. My stomach lurched. I hadn't told anyone about my morning routine. There was no way he could know. No way. I don't think you should lie to me, Doctor, he continued, his voice growing darker, more menacing. I see everything. The way you park on the left side of your driveway, the fact that you keep your porch light on until midnight every night. I know when you lock your doors, when you leave for work. It's almost like I'm right there with you. I stared at him, my pulse racing. There was no way he could be watching me. No way. But every detail he mentioned was true. My stomach clenched with fear, but I maintained my composure. I had to. Vincent, I said, my voice firmer than I felt, we're done for today. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me, his dark eyes boring into mine. I could feel him relishing in my torture. I'll see you tomorrow, Doctor. Maybe we can talk about the photo next time. I tried to think if there had been a photo found at the scene of one of his crimes. I didn't ask. In that moment, I didn't want to know. I just had to get out of that room. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the locks 3 times, drew all the curtains, and sat in the dark, clutching my phone. Every creak of that house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. I didn't sleep. When I returned to the prison the next day, Vincent was already waiting for me, the same unsettling smile on his face. I hadn't told anyone what had happened. I hadn't reported his behavior, because what could I say? There was no proof, just a feeling, a creeping terror I couldn't shake. Did you check the basement yet? He asked as soon as I sat down. Vincent, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. His grin widened. I think you should. There are things down there you've forgotten about. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't have a basement, at least not a real one. The house was old, and the basement was unfinished, just a place I stored a few boxes and never thought about. But the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, it made me question it. It made me question everything. I don't have time for games, Vincent, I said, standing up, desperate to end the session. Oh, Doctor, he said, his voice low and chilling. I'm not playing a game. I just want to help you feel something. I walked out of the room, my legs shaking, my mind racing with fear. Somehow I got through my last 2 sessions, thankful it was Friday and I was off for 3 days. I needed the time off. I had to go out of town for the weekend, but I was preoccupied by what Vincent had said. As soon as I got home on Monday night, I went straight to the basement. The door creaked open, and the smell of damp earth hit me as I descended the stairs. There were just a few old boxes covered in dust, the concrete walls stained with age, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. A photo tucked into the corner of one of the boxes. It was placed in a way that would be impossible to miss. It was of me, standing in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee, my breath caught in my throat, the angle, it was from outside the window. My phone rang, making me jump. I pulled it out, my hand shaking. "I told you I see everything, doctor, and I'll see you soon." The line went dead, and I was left standing in the dark in the basement, the cold grip of terror wrapping around me tighter than ever before, as I realized it was the 28th, and Vincent had been released that morning. Every morning, I ride my bike through Central Park before the sun comes up. It's the only time when the city seems quiet, before the buzz of people and traffic consumes the streets. The air is always cooler, crisp against my skin, and the park is usually deserted, with just the distant hum of the city echoing in the background. This morning felt no different. I had started my usual route, weaving along the winding paths, my breath steady, and the rhythm of my pedaling smooth. The lampposts that lined the park glowed just enough to see by, just illuminating the shadows. But I enjoyed this time, the solitude, the peace. It was mine, in a city that never really slept. As I rounded a corner by the reservoir, something caught my eye. Just up ahead, at the edge of my vision, I saw it. Water on the path. That wasn't unusual. Rain often pooled in the cracks. But the earth was dry except for this area. It hadn't rained. It was too dark, too thick to be rain, and it was smeared, almost like it had been dragged across the pavement. I slowed down, my intuition telling me something was wrong. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just water. The liquid looked too deep, too red. It was blood. My hands tightened on the handlebars. I told myself it had to be something else, a spill, maybe, or some prank, but the thick, congealed look of it made me instantly regret slowing down. I forced myself to ride past it, my stomach nodding, but as I continued, the streaks continued too, winding along the path in long, uneven smears. The deeper into the park I went, the worse it got. I didn't want to stop. I wanted to get out of there, but my curiosity was pulling me forward, making me pedal faster instead of turning back. Ahead, the path opened up into a clearing near the great lawn. I could see a familiar oak tree that stood at its center, huge and ancient. But as I approached, my chest tightened. There was something on the tree, hanging from it. I stopped, my bike skidding to a halt. My breath came in short bursts now as I stared at what looked like fabric. Something draped over one of the thick branches, swaying gently. It looked like an old piece of clothing, maybe a coat or a dress, but it was too large, too long. The material was wet, drenched in the same dark liquid that stained the path behind me. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized it wasn't fabric, it was fur. A massive pelt of fur, hanging by its neck. The head of some animal drooped over the branch, hollow and empty. I couldn't tell what animal it had been, a dog or a deer, but the body was stretched unnaturally, distorted beyond recognition, and beneath it the ground was soaked. The air was thick with a fresh coppery smell. and it suffocated me, filling my lungs. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My body felt frozen. Suddenly, the wind picked up with a force that made the pelt sway. Leaves twisted violently through the air as if the trees themselves were exhaling, pushing the wind outward. The branches above groaned, their old wood creaking, bending towards me. I turned and stared down the path from the direction where I'd come, and then from behind me I heard it, the faint sound of something being dragged across the ground. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness. I didn't see anything at first, but the sound continued, getting louder and closer. It was coming from where the pelt had been hanging. Something heavy was scraping across the concrete in long, deliberate movements. My heart pounded in my chest, my ears ringing with each thud of my pulse. I told myself to get back on the bike, to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The dragging sound stopped. I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones as I stared into the shadows, listening. The darkness of the park felt vast, isolated and menacing, as though it was swallowing me whole. Every shadow stretched, every sound amplified in the thick, pressing darkness. I strained my eyes, scanning the path in front of me, trying to see what had made the noise. There, in the dim glow of the street lights, I saw something, a shape, low to the ground, shuffling forward. My stomach lurched. It was the animal, or what was left of it. The fur that had been hanging from the tree was now dragging itself across the path, moving slowly, like something inside of it was crawling. There was no head, no limbs, just the mangled pelt sliding along the pavement in jerking, unnatural motions. I couldn't process what I was seeing. It made no sense. The thing had no life in it, yet it moved. My body tensed, every muscle screaming for me to turn around and leave. My mind trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before me. But then, without warning, the fur stopped. It lay still for a moment, silent and lifeless. Slowly, it began to rise. Not fully, not like an animal standing on all fours. It just lifted slightly, as if something underneath it was pushing upward. I watched in horror as the fur parted and a dark shadow, something that looked like smoke, rose out of it and slinked around the old tree, dissipating into the leaves above. My entire body was shaking. I wanted to leave and ride away as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop staring at where it had vanished. What had I just seen? What could possibly explain that? My mind raced, searching for any rational answer, but there was none. The word sacrifice filled my brain, and I couldn't shake the thought that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. My muscles finally unlocked. I turned my bike around and pedaled away, faster than I've ever pedaled before. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if something was following me. All I knew was that something unnatural had happened in the park that early morning, and I never wanted to come near it again. I remember the night I became claustrophobic. It was one of those stormy nights, the kind where the sky seems to crack open with blinding flashes followed by deep, rumbling thunder that vibrates through the ground. The wind howled around the corners of the building as I stood in the lobby waiting for the elevator. I was already feeling a little uneasy. Storms always unsettled me a little, but when the elevator doors slid open, I was almost relieved. I just wanted to get to my apartment and wait out the storm in the safety of my living room. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 9th floor. The doors were about to close when I heard someone call out from behind me, "Hold the door!" Instinctively, I reached out and hit the open button. The doors slowly creaked apart again, and in stepped a man. He was tall, his posture a little hunched, with a hood pulled over his head, shadowing his face. His clothes were drenched from the rain, clinging to his body, and there was a strange smell, earthy, like musty and sour wet leaves. He didn't make eye contact with me as he stepped in, and I immediately regretted holding the door for him. Something about him felt off. He stood a little too close, given the space in the elevator. I shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor buttons as the doors slid shut. The elevator began its slow ascent, the sound of the cables humming overhead. Thunder rumbled in the distance, louder this time, and I could hear the rain pounding against the building's exterior. I tried to focus on the floor numbers, willing the elevator to move faster. Just as we passed the 3rd floor, the lights flickered. My heart jumped, and I glanced up at the ceiling. The elevator gave a slight shudder, and then, without warning, everything went black. The hum of the elevator and its motion stopped, and we were plunged into total darkness. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. My fingers instinctively reached for my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to pull it out. I didn't want to illuminate the small space. I didn't want to see him. The silence was suffocating. I could hear the man's breathing in the dark, heavy and labored, close, too close. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine as I stood there, paralyzed, trying to control my own breath. The storm raged outside, the faint sound of thunder and rain muffled by the thick walls of the elevator. For a few moments, we just stood there, two strangers trapped in the dark, the storm making the world outside seem far away. Then I heard it. A soft, wheezing sound from the man, almost like a cough, but deeper, wet and ragged. My own pulse quickened. His breathing grew louder, more strained, like he was gasping for air. The sound of his labored inhalations filled the tiny, pitch-black space, and then, thud. It was a sickening, heavy sound, as if something or someone hit the ground. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I reached out in the darkness, hesitant, my hand trembling as I tried to feel for the buttons to press the emergency alarm. I couldn't see anything. My hand brushed the wall, the cold metal of the elevator panel slick with moisture, his moisture. The wet wheezing started again, but now it was coming from below me, closer to the ground. I crouched down, still fumbling for my phone, when I heard a sudden, sharp inhalation, then nothing. The breathing stopped. I stayed perfectly still, crouched in the darkness, straining my ears for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, that presses in on you from all sides. Had he fainted? Was he dead? I didn't want to move. I didn't want to reach out and touch him, but the idea of staying in that tiny dark space with someone, something, possibly lifeless, was unbearable. I fumbled again for my phone, finally pulling it out from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to unlock it. The weak glow of the screen illuminated the elevator, casting long shadows across the walls. My heart pounded as I turned the light toward the floor. He was lying there, crumpled in the corner of the elevator. His hood had fallen back, revealing a pale face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. His skin looked waxy, almost unnatural in the dim light. I couldn't tell if he was breathing. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crouched lower, my phone shaking in my hand. I wanted to reach out to check his pulse, but I was terrified of what I might find. As I moved closer, I noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible twitch in his hand. Before I could react, his eyes snapped open, and I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The screen flickered as it hit the ground. He was staring at me now, his eyes wide, unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. The light from my phone flickered again, then went out. We were plunged back into darkness. I scrambled to find my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to feel for it on the cold elevator floor. I could hear him shifting, the wet sound of his body moving on the floor, his breathing now coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Then, nothing. Silence again. I sat there in the darkness, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe, waiting for something, anything. But the silence stretched on, heavy. I tried to call for him, but there was only silence. Seconds stretched into minutes, and I knew I had to find my phone. Reaching my hands along the floor in the darkness, I felt his wet clothes and slid my hands under his leg, finally feeling the cold screen. I shined the light from my screen onto his face and screamed. His lifeless eyes stared up at me, his arms to his sides. The man was gone. I scrambled to the opposite corner and called 911. When the responders finally arrived, I had been in that tiny, hot, pitch-black space with that man's lifeless body for almost 4 hours. My phone had died after 53 minutes. I had been delivering pizzas for about 6 months, and most of the time it was boring and uneventful, just another night of dropping off pizzas to people who barely gave you a second glance as they handed you crumpled bills or swiped their cards. But tonight was different. It was a cold, rainy evening, and the order came through just as I was about to clock out. A single large pepperoni out to the edge of town. The address was weird, a location I'd never heard of, but I figured it was just one of those newly built houses or something. I grabbed the pizza and headed out. As I drove, the rain began to come down harder, blurring the windshield and making it difficult to see. The roads were slick, and I had to squint to make out the signs. Eventually, I turned onto a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead nowhere. The houses became sparse, and the streetlights disappeared, leaving only the eerie glow of my car's headlights cutting through the misty darkness. I double-checked the GPS. It insisted I was close, but there was no house in sight, just trees, darkness, and the sound of rain pounding on the roof of my car. I finally spotted a narrow driveway, barely visible through the overgrown brush. The GPS told me this was the place. I hesitated for a moment. The driveway was long, disappearing into the woods, and something about it felt wrong. But it was late, and I just wanted to finish the delivery and go home. So I turned in and slowly drove up the gravel path, the sound of the stones crunching under the tires, the only noise besides the rain. At the end of the driveway, a house appeared out of the gloom. It was old, dilapidated, boards hanging loose, windows dark and covered in grime. No lights were on, but the GPS said I had arrived. I pulled up, turned off the car, and sat there for a moment staring at the house. It didn't look like anyone lived there. The place felt abandoned, but someone had ordered a pizza. With the box in hand, I got out of the car. The air was cold and wet, and the smell of damp earth hung heavy in the air. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pattered against my jacket and onto the pizza box as I walked up to the front porch. The wooden steps creaked as I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I turned to leave, but then, just as I took a step back, a light flickered on inside, faint and yellow, barely illuminating the hallway beyond the door. Hello? No one responded, but I saw the door handle slowly turn. The door creaked open just a crack, enough to see the shadow of someone standing inside. Pizza delivery? The shadow didn't move or speak, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something about the way the figure stood there, just out of sight, creeped me out. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease. Your pizza's here. I reached forward with the box. Still, no answer. I took a step forward, my hand brushing against the door to push it open a little more, but the moment I touched it, the door swung wide with a sudden force, as if yanked open from the inside. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and looked into the dimly lit room. It was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare, rotting floorboards and walls that seemed to sag under the weight of time. But there, standing in the middle of the room, was the man that had been the shadow. His back was to me, his clothes disheveled and dirty, his hands hanging limply at his sides. His head was tilted slightly to the side, as if he was listening for something. "Sir?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. But he didn't move. I took another cautious step inside, setting the pizza down on the floor near the doorway. "Here's your pizza. I'll just leave it here, okay?" Suddenly, the man's head snapped to the side in a jerky, unnatural motion. I froze. He was still facing away from me, but the way he was looking sideways at me was unnerving. I didn't order the pizza. The voice was quiet, like he was trying to be coy. He kept staring at me over his shoulder, standing very still in the low light. I didn't hear or see anyone else in the house, but it was very dark. I wanted to leave, to run out of that house and never look back, but my feet were glued to the floor. I tried to speak, to apologize and leave, but no sound came out. "I didn't order the pizza," he said again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the empty house. I took a step back, my hand reaching for the door. But before I could move, he turned all the way around to face me. His sunken, hollow eyes were staring straight into mine, wide and unblinking. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach lurch in terror, was the smile. A wide, unnatural grin, too large for his face, stretched from ear to ear. It was a smile that didn't belong, a smile that spoke of things far more predatory than just a wrong delivery. "I didn't order the pizza," he whispered, his voice low and rasping. My hand fumbled for the door handle, but before I could turn it, the man took a step forward, and then another. His movements were quick, almost inhuman. He was coming at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally yanked the door open and stumbled back onto the porch. I didn't look back as I ran to my car, the rain soaking me through as I fumbled with my keys. I could hear the door creaking behind me, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor growing louder. I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine, tearing down the driveway as fast as I could, the tires skidding on the wet gravel. My heart was racing, my hands shaking on that steering wheel. As I sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The man was standing on the porch, watching me, with that wide, terrifying grin still plastered on his face. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.